So it might seem like some of the interface limitations are quite limited in PdWebParty, but I wanted to show an example of how you can take the interface options and turn them into something that's a bit more complex. So in particular, I wanted to show the radio buttons and how you could turn them into something quite complicated. So here it is. I've made a radio button sequencer. So this may look really complicated, but let's have a listen. Ooh, yeah. Okay, so how did I make this? Well, here it is. Let's have a look. Is it already open? No. Okay, so let's have a look at the PD patch. Careful analysis will make you realize that this is not a single giant grid. It's actually one, I don't know how many, 16, I think. 16 radio buttons, vertical radio buttons that are each 12 cells tall, 40. They've all got their initialize button activated, and they all have a different name, similar to my Bad Mellotron patch. So this one's step 0, the next one over will be step 1, and so on, all the way up to step 15. So these will all give out a set of numbers from 0 to 11, and they will send those numbers out each individual names. I've got a toggle up here for starting, which works the same as most things. This is a tempo slider and a bang to randomize all of them. And then I've got a little bar along the bottom, which is just a horizontal slider. I could probably click and move it, but as soon as I get it going again, it'll jump into place. And that's just showing me where in the sequence I am. So let's have a look at the patch. I've split this patch out into a few sub patches because there are a number of elements happening here. The first is whenever I change one of these, you can see it's actually changing this sequence on the right. And it's doing that in a way that if you haven't done too much with PD yet, I wouldn't really worry that much about this. But if you do want to see it, it's in this little sub patch called PD write steps to array. So what I'm doing is I've split this out into 4 little sections. They're 4 identical sections. It was just a little bit easier to me. You could do this in one gigantic thing if you wanted. I'm using the tab write object to write to a sequence. I'm receiving each one of these steps. So step 0, step 1, step 2. I'm reversing it so that instead of going from 11 to 0, it's going from 0 to 11. Just because radio buttons inexplicably work the opposite of how a standard array works. I mean, it is explicable, but it's not worth caring about. Then that is giving me a number. I'm sending that number as a pair of numbers to tab write, and then writing the specific value that I just changed to that step in the sequence. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to be able to read that sequence whenever I click the toggle. So when I click the toggle, it comes through here, receive on off, and it turns on and off a metro object. As you'll probably remember, if you've used PD much, metro just sends out a stream of bangs. You can see them there. This section here, the message object with a 1, or this message box with a 1 in it, a plus object, a number box. This is making a little counter. So every time you press it, it goes up high, goes up by 1. I'm using the modulo object to turn that into a loop of 16 numbers, 0 to 15, 0 to 15, 0 to 15. I'm reading that sequence, and that gives me a number. And that number will be an integer because I'm only writing integers to it using my number boxes. And I'm sending it out a receive, which is this. This is my horizontal slider, which is set to receive receive location. This is the first time I've actually used the receive symbols for any of my GUI objects in these tutorials. I don't have this set to initialize. I just have it going from 0 to 16, and then I'm adding 0.5 to it so that it actually goes in the middle of each box. Otherwise, it would go at the beginning of each box, and it's a bit less clear. So this is just for my own benefit so that I know where I am in the sequence. So I've got a tempo calculator, which is really simple. I'm taking a number, which we can look at it. It's going from 0 to 1. I've set this to initialize. There's a send symbol of tempo and a receive symbol of receive tempo. When I move this slider, it sends out tempo. I make that go from 0 to 1 instead of from 1 to 0. And I'm just multiplying it by 500 and then plus 100. This gives me a range of 100 to 600 milliseconds, which was like a nice. You could try different values in here to make a different range of tempos, and that gives me. Okay, now what's my actual synth? You'll notice that that one sounds quite different. Now instead, just as an extra little thing, instead of using either of the synth techniques that I used in the first couple episodes of this, I'm using another one called tab-osc, which is quite fun. With tab-osc, you use a table, which has to be a quite specific length. I chose 259. It's really not worth caring about why I chose 259, but it needs to be 259 in my case. And otherwise, I just send it a frequency the same I would any other synthesis object. So I'm taking the number 0 to 11, adding 30 to it, converting that to frequency, and then I've made a little volume envelope. Now the volume envelope is it's hard-coded to be 100 milliseconds long, so it goes from 0 to 1 in 5 milliseconds, waits for 5 milliseconds before then dropping back down to 0 over 100 milliseconds. And I'm getting that pulse here after this Moses object. What Moses is doing is it's ignoring any time I've selected something down here, the 0, the absolute minimum of my radio buttons. And that means I can have the steps be on or off. So it's just a really shortcut way of just having a way of turning off each step, right? Okay, so what Moses does is any value that's less than 1, it sends out this output, which we're not using, so we're just ignoring it. Any outputs 1 and greater comes out here, so that triggers a bang, which is my pulse, which I'm using to trigger the volume envelope, and then float, which is my value, which is the frequency that I use for my synthesizer. Then I'm running that all into tab-osc wave, which is fun because you can actually draw on it. Let's Ooh, that's nice. Ooh. It was quite a satisfying way of building a sine wave, and that will be saved in the patch once I've changed it. So the bigger, the higher you go and the lower you go, the more the amplitude the wave will have. So it'll sound a bit beefier. So it's nice to start with a beefy one and then add some high frequency noise in here, just like with a few taps. So it's a very silly synthesis method, but it works surprisingly well. Okay, and the last thing I've got is a randomizer. This takes a little getting used to making, but it's actually quite straightforward. It's hard-coded to be a 16-step randomizer. So whenever I click the bang button, this bang, which is a randomizer, it sends the symbol randomize, which I'm receiving here. Then I use that to trigger the number 16. 16 gets sent into a bang, which initializes this down to 0. And then it goes into the until object, which is a dangerous beast, but if you do use it correctly, it can be really useful. When you send it a number, it will very rapidly send out that number of bangs. So it's sending out 16 bangs in the space of milliseconds. So I'm counting from 0 to 15 really quickly. It's like that. Then I'm using those two numbers to send a value equal to the name of that step, right? So it'll be like step 0 and then a random number from 0 to 12. Then step 1, then a random number from 0 to 12. Then step 2, a random number from 0 to 12. It does all of that mega quick. And it's doing that by renaming the send object for each step. So it renames the send object to whichever is the current counter being generated here, and then it gives it a random number. So that means that all looks like it should take a while to do, but it happens instantaneously. You can see you can actually do it really quick. And the fun part about this is that it's also randomizing the on-off of my sequences, because it will be generating zeros occasionally. If you wanted to make this a bit more complex, you could have some control over the volume envelope. So like, let's do it like that instead and see what it sounds like. Right, so right now we have no control over that. We have to hard code it. I'm going to put it back to what it was, but you could have controls over that. You could then also put a filter in it in the same way that I did in one of the previous tutorials. There are a number of ways you could extend this, of course, but that's the start for how to use radio buttons in a kind of advanced way to do a step sequencer. Right, I hope that makes sense. Okay, thanks for following along.